Very good. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, apologies for the some major technical difficulties that we faced. We're getting started a bit late, so I will skip any introductory remarks. Let me just note or introduce myself very briefly. My name is Jarmo Sareva. I am the Finnish Foreign Ministry Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, and it gives me particular pleasure to join today's meeting as moderator because I have been appointed as the next Consul General of Finland in New York, effective September the 1st this year. And I want to thank the Consulate General for organizing today's meeting, and I want to especially thank the panelists who are joining us today. And as you all have seen from the invitation, today's panel will focus on the current cybersecurity environment in the United States, as well as possible solutions and best practices from Finland to develop cybersecurity and the resilience of critical infrastructure in the United States. I will now introduce the panelists very briefly. We have Johanna Erkkilä, who is the Director of Assessments and Supervision at the National Cybersecurity Center of Finland, KTK or KTK. KTK operates under the Transport and Communications Agency, or Traficom of Finland, and it is charged with developing and monitoring the reliability and security of Finland's communications networks and services. So welcome, Johanna. We have then David Chartier, or Chartier in French. He's the CEO of ArcticSecure, which is a long-term cybersecurity professional. He's a long-term cybersecurity professional and the former CEO of Codenimicom. And the French pronunciation was a joke. ArcticSecure, the company, is a disruptor in cybersecurity with a mission to help people to defend their assets, and the company is headquartered in the northern city of Oulu, which itself is a great success story of Finnish tech. Has seen some hard times, but is now seeing some very good times. Then we have Colin Ahern, who is an internationally recognized cybersecurity, cyber resilience, and cloud technologies expert. Colin is an adjunct associate professor at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and he has a distinguished past career with the city of New York, including as acting chief information security officer of the city. And last but not least, we have Mikko Hyppönen joining us. Mikko is the chief research officer for Finland's largest cybersecurity company, WithSecure. And Mikko is an internationally renowned and well-known writer, presenter, speaker. He has written about his research for many publications, including New York Times, Wired, and Scientific American. And Mikko was selected as the Cybersecurity Person of the Year back in 2020. Now, the panel will be focusing on identifying pressing issues by diving a bit deeper into the apparent increase in the sophistication of cyber attacks, and then end with a solution-oriented discussion on public-private collaboration, on public-private partnerships, on increased cyber funding and best practices from Finland and the United States. And let's go straight to the warm-up takes of today's discussion. Please, panelists, no more than 1 minute answering the proposition that I'm making. Is cybersecurity the single biggest risk for any organization in stable industrial societies? What is your take on this? 1 minute max, please. And let's go in the order. Johanna first.
Yeah, the structure of the critical infrastructure is of course different in every country, but the functioning of the society consists of similar elements everywhere, like food protection and supply, energy supply, water management, financial services, health services and communication networks. And these services are more and more based on technological operating systems, which means that critical services are vulnerable if there's a cyber threat or attack. And because we know these attacks are global by their nature and they don't protect or respect the borders of the countries, similar issues can be faced in Finland and in the US and everywhere in the world.
Yes, I think it's one of the most important, maybe not the most important, but it's obviously a very important risk out there. As we heard, a lot of the stuff is the same equipment being run everywhere. So cyber attacks can allow adversary to remotely disrupt very many things, very many places, very easy, and so forth. So it's obviously a big risk. I don't know if it's the biggest risk. There's other risks that are out there that could be worse done in person and so forth, but obviously a very high risk and something we need to address very quickly.
I think it is also one. I think maybe more broadly, fragility or a lack of resiliency overall is the biggest risk. There's a number of threats that critical infrastructure faces: climate change, obviously, the global security environment, which is obviously concerning and getting more so. Cyber is definitely, I agree with David, one of the most important threat vectors that adversaries, do seek in order to hold targets at risk, including critical infrastructure targets, criminal elements with links to state-backed entities. But I think maybe more at a different, with a different lens, the assumption that everything is going to be okay on behalf of, people that operate large technology environments and in particular critical infrastructure providers, which maybe is in their short-term economic interests, but is definitely not in the long-term interests of the residents and the visitors and the businesses that these infrastructure providers serve.
Mikko, you're muted currently, and Jarmo as well.
Classic. So what I was saying is that when technology is good enough, when it's useful enough, modern societies don't want to live without it. Eventually, modern societies can't live without it. This happened with electricity, and it's happening right now with connectivity. And it's happening for a reason. If you look at the revolution of electricity for the last 150 years, yes, we are now very dependent. We're more dependent on electricity than we are on connectivity, which is bad, but the upsides our societies have gotten from electrifying everything have been much bigger than the fact that we are now dependent on it. Exactly the same thing is happening right now with connectivity. And that means, from my point of view, is cyber the biggest risk? It's a very big risk. I think dependence on electricity is even bigger. Of course, you can disrupt electricity by hacking. Then again, you can also disrupt connectivity by cutting electricity. It's all becoming connected to everything else. However, one main point we have to take into account here is that attacking critical infrastructure used to be something which could only be done by really powerful players, typically governments. They needed, big weapons to attack with. In cyber world, almost anyone gains access to the kind of weapons which in real world would be only in the hands of governments and militaries. And that's why this matters so much right now.
Thank you, Mikko, and thank you for great answers. And Mikko, as you rightly pointed out, the democratization of the ability to inflict harm, by smaller malicious actors. That's something that is very different from the past. Now, let's go then to the actual discussion of today's panel. And I'd like to put the following question or questions to you, and then go into the discussion. Firstly, what, in your view, are the three most vulnerable critical utilities in the United States today, and what are the main threats that they face? Secondly, McKinsey estimated just this past March that through new AI and machine learning technology, cyber attacks are likely to become much more sophisticated in the near and of course medium future. And how will this affect those critical services that are already falling behind in cybersecurity? And then the third issue, and we'll be taking these one by one, but to sensitize you and the audience to what lies ahead. The third issue is about cybersecurity having emerged as a key concern for the Biden administration, and the Biden administration having then proposed to increase its 2023 budget by almost $500 million to strengthen cyber defense and improve investigative capabilities across the government. But as a large part of critical infrastructure is privately owned and privately operated, how should private-public collaboration be developed in moving forward? And what are the best practices coming from Finland, which prides itself on being one of the leaders in public-private partnerships and collaboration in terms of protecting critical infrastructure from malicious cyber activity. So the first issue, what are the three most critical utilities in the US today, and what type of threats do they face? Let's work in reverse order. Mikko, if you could answer first.
Sure. I'll point couple ones. I'm sure we will have some variety here. So I'll throw in first supply chain problems, especially supply chain producing current connectivity gear, including 5G technologies, and producing the CPUs and microchips and everything else we use inside our hardware. And these are good ones to pinpoint because these are areas where USA used to be the world leader and now they are not. There's no major 5G manufacturer operating from United States. The big ones are outside of the United States. And the fastest and best silicon is being made in Taiwan, which is so much ahead of the rest of the world in producing cutting-edge technology that no one else can compete anymore with TSMC, which is a weird development in the historical sense. And let me just also point out to the fact that kings of the hill like Intel are now a fraction of the market cap they used to be. For example, Nvidia is like 2 or 3 times bigger as a company, which is surprising when people hear about that. So supply chain for our technology is clearly one which is fragile, and it's hard to secure. Easy way to secure supply chains for semiconductors and silicons, it would be to replicate what TSMC is doing in Taiwan. That would take a decade and billions, which is unlikely to happen. Another one I'll throw out here before I let others to continue is food. Now, we saw the big ransomware attack against meat manufacturing and meat industry in the United States last year. That's a good example, but that's not really what I'm thinking about here. Sure, you can disrupt manufacturing of food in various different ways, or either sourcing or actual storage and moving and supply chain. But you don't have to disrupt it. You can, if you are able to break into these systems, these factories, all of these processes are being controlled by computers, which means you can, in theory, turn food into poison in ways, or make food much less healthier by breaking into the processes that we are using to make the food we feed to our citizens. A lot of nasty attacks that could be done in the producement network and distribution network of the food we eat. And that's from me.
Thank you. Colin.
I think going along with Mikko's theme, transportation kind of as a subset or as adjacent to the supply chain. I'm thinking about Maersk, the large shipping company, which was dramatically affected by the NotPetya event. And in the current geopolitical climate, with already inflationary pressures and supply chain disruptions, a significant cyber attack against the quite limited number of players that conduct overseas container transportation would have pretty dramatic second and third order effects for the Western world, the Western set of alliances. I think also telecom, as we've seen the movement from the plain old telephone system or POTS to voice over IP. The resiliency of the voice over IP infrastructure is much different. The regulatory environment is much different. And it used to be said that when the internet stops working, the phones start ringing. But now that the phones are over the internet, they both stop working. And I think healthcare, unlike some other critical infrastructure sectors, healthcare is becoming more digitized, which is undoubtedly a good thing. You're seeing really the democratization of telemedicine through the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also see events like the Irish National Health Service, which was affected by a ransomware event. And so that's one in which traditional critical infrastructure protective measures like air gapping networks, like data diodes, or one-way telecoms infrastructure are not appropriate for the way that business is evolving. And it's also a business that's obviously got a very challenging and contentious history, in particular in the United States.
Great answers, David. You're muted.
Sorry. In the US, I think there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and we've looked at most of them, and I think it's difficult to call out which ones are best and which ones are worse, because in every category you have some players that have a high maturity and are doing a fairly good job, and then you have a whole lot of players that are doing a middle or below average job on just basic IT security. So, we see most companies struggling with knowing what their attack surface is. So if you don't know what you have, you can't defend it. So if they do know what they have, they probably don't know what software they're running on their stuff. Again, that makes a big problem, because if you don't know what you have, you don't know what to update. So the big struggle is knowing what you have and then, keeping that updated, because the bad guys, they can use a lot of easy stuff that already exists out there, because there's tons of vulnerable services that are remotely exploitable. And, stuff that's been around in the market for years. We saw one critical electricity producer using software from Microsoft from 2005 today and having huge, attack surface that's not very good. So people using old software, not knowing what they have, the buyers don't know what they have, and just not doing basic IT security. So I think, it's a real call to action to get on top of, do the basics, know what you have, make sure you can track it, and make sure you're updated on getting your software, at the current version. Then you're going to make it a lot harder. So again, I think critical infrastructure often is struggling on this. So again, hard to call any three, but I think we need to get the maturity level of everyone, substantially higher to, literally keep the lights on and keep the food on the table.
Yeah, thank you. In other words, in an increasingly interconnected world, an interconnected economy, we're only as resilient and strong as the weakest link. Quite often it's about what's here that makes us weak or strong. Now, Johanna, what's your take?
Yes, for me it's difficult to choose the most critical or the most vulnerable, but I also think the world is so interconnected that the cyber threats we are facing, they are affecting on our everyday life. They are not present anymore in the virtual world, but they are having more and more real physical effects, like how can we log into our online banking, or can we buy food in the supermarket, or how our health data is protected in the data systems. And because of these complex interconnections, it can be very difficult to predict all the consequences of cyber attack on some utility. Like if we think about the electricity blackouts, a couple of hours electricity cut, it's annoying, but it's not affecting us or our society. But when we start talking about 3 days, it becomes really, really critical. So I think it's very important that the critical infrastructure is defined and that there's a continuous risk assessment process in place.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This discussion reminds me of something that I'm increasingly thinking about, and that is the complexity of today's civilization, of societies, of economies. And as we know, increased complexities make systems more vulnerable. And it was Colin who pointed out that especially right now with a war going on, the vulnerability of supply chains of shipping is particularly acute. Let's move on to the next topic, which I listed earlier, and that was about the fact that with AI and machine learning, cyber attacks are likely to become much more sophisticated, and pretty soon. So how will this affect those critical services that are already falling behind in cybersecurity, either due to underinvestment or lack of knowing, or for other reasons? Let's start with Johanna.
Thank you. As the technology is advancing fast, cyber criminals and other actors are of course constantly developing their capabilities and trying to find new ways of attacking. And considering the digital operating environment of the critical services like energy, telecommunications, and food supply, then 100% protection of critical infrastructure is impossible to reach. And I think we should focus on the resilience of the services, how quickly the utilities can recover from these attacks, as there will always be cyber attacks. And that those fast technological improvements mean that the improvements of cybersecurity need to be also a continuous process. But if we try to look at this from more like positive perspective, the advanced technology can also be used when protecting our infrastructure from the attacks. And of course, companies are in key roles developing the technologies and services which can help. And I think it's very important to integrate cybersecurity in all technologies, processes, and functions in every field.
Thank you, Johanna. David, what's
Yeah.
your view?
My take is that, first of all, one of my views is the bad guys are a little bit like electricity. They often take the path of least resistance. And when we're out looking at the market, in America, I just looked this week, it's maybe 30,000 companies have compromised machines that they don't know about. Maybe double that, almost 70,000 have vulnerable services that are exposed to the internet that they don't know about. So the bad guys have lots of ways to get in already, and they've already been big on automation. So I think automation is probably going to be one of the tools you're going to see more of. And because there's so many poor IT practices that they can leverage where they don't have to expend any new attacks, because if you create a new attack, a new 0 day, that's quite costly for you. And then you may want to save that for a higher value target, because once it's discovered, there comes countermeasures and there's people that can block it, people that can find it. So I think you can see the criminal element is really going for, I think, the easy stuff that doesn't have a high cost for them, and they get free IT because they compromise machines, and they can use those machines to automate the attacks and find new machines and so forth. So I think it's again, I'm back to harping on, we have to get better on IT basics, because it's fun to talk about the advanced attacks and AI and all this stuff because it's interesting, but I think, it's such a big problem on the low end that we need to fix that, while we're still talking about what to do against the more complicated things that are going to come.
So it's once again about needing to know what you have, so as to be able to protect and defend yourself.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, IT basics out there. And if more companies did these, we'd all be way better off. So again, it's like, the defenders have to think, what can we do that's easy and effective to make ourselves more secure? Having the latest software, knowing your attack surface, doing, basic IT prudent practices makes it a lot tougher for the bad guys, and will force them to use these more expensive for them new techniques that they're developing, which is good, because it raises the cost for them, because they're also a business. They want low cost, high return on value.
Yeah. Colin, would you agree?
Yeah, I do. I am reminded by a quote by Winston Churchill: "The dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerged after World War I." Like, the technology gets better every day, and that's fine. However, in the latest Mandiant M-Trends report, 80% of attacks started with a compromised credential. Like David said, that's poor configuration, poor asset management, a series of other practices. And I think additionally, the role of cryptocurrency is probably even more significant than AI. The ability of ransomware as a service providers, of access brokers, of others to monetize access, to monetize data. Used to be that, money mules and follow the money. It was complicated to monetize access remotely. Now it's actually very straightforward to monetize access. So like David said, from a business proposition, it's a challenging economic environment, made even more so by the widespread lack of basic IT practices and the ready monetization that creates this criminal ecosystem, which, if you're a bad actor, is like a virtuous cycle in which you can continually obtain access, monetize it readily, either by passing it off to other people up higher up the criminal food chain, or even nation states, in particular the Russians, obviously, but also others, and in which IT feels overwhelmed because of the increasing pace of vulnerability discovery, which is, because of these this economic ecosystem created by this, criminal underground.
Yeah, and especially as there are states. You mentioned one, but there are others which condone and also profit from tolerating cyber criminality in their territory against the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Mikko, what's your take?
Let me continue on what Colin said about vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities exists because the developers made mistakes, and people make mistakes because they are people, they are human. And the more we have code, the more we have room for error. Like you said, Jarmo, complexity is the enemy of security. The more code we have, the more complex it is. So what's the fix? Well, one way we could try to figure our way out of this is by removing the human who makes errors. And we are on our way towards a future where code is writing code. We have that already. It's still in its very early stages, but it's picking up speed very quickly. And I do estimate that we will, in near future, see examples of programming programs which are able to rewrite their own code. So you can imagine a program which can write programs, and you give it a task of rewriting itself in a more optimized manner, and then repeat the loop, and then repeat the loop, and you end up with a program where not a single human has a goddamn clue on what the program really does and why it does what it does like it does. And when you have powerful enough systems writing the programs that we use, they won't have bugs, which means they won't have vulnerabilities, or they might have bugs, but the bugs are so complicated that humans would never be able to exploit them. If something would be able to exploit them, it might be another AI. All this sounds pretty science fiction-like, but this isn't that far away. If you look at what, for example, GitHub is doing right now with the GitHub Copilot, it's already showing the first steps of programs which write programs. Now, thinking about practical terms, defenders, companies like ours, we've been using machine learning and AI for, well, we started ours 17 years ago. The first programs which were using learning, what we implemented in 2005, yet the attackers haven't yet jumped into this bandwagon yet. And that's partially because what David said. Why would they do that if they're making great profit with the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit? Now, eventually they will, and I think it's going to happen in the next 2 years or so. And I believe the most obvious thing they will start doing is automating the malware campaigns they run, which are now being run by humans. So right now the attacks are operated at human speed, but the response and defense is operated at machine speed. So defenders, programs, the things security companies build, pick up attacks automatically, analyze them automatically, build defenses automatically, and respond very quickly. And then the attackers, with human power, change their attack, rewrite the code, change the emails they are sending out to steal people's credentials, or change the exploit, or change the website which contains some kind of an exploit kit, what have you. That's going to be automated. They're going to automate their part. And then we'll end up with this really quickly escalating race between good AI and bad AI. And we know that this hasn't happened yet because we wouldn't miss this. Right now, it's a very clear difference between defenders and attackers. And when the attackers change to automation like we do, we will see it, and it hasn't happened yet.
Thank you. Fascinating. We are at 5 p.m. But let's take a really quick round on the last question, which is very important. It's about the priorities of the Biden administration, the increased funding, and then the fact that critical infrastructure is to a large part privately owned and operated. So how can public-private collaboration, how can partnerships move the needle forward, and how can companies then turn this into business opportunities? Mikko, why don't you continue and then go from there to Johanna?
Whenever I compare notes with my colleagues elsewhere in Europe or in Middle East or in North America, I do get questions about how do we organize all this in Finland, and how come you seem to be doing things differently from many other countries. And of course, Finland is in a unique situation in many ways. We are pretty high-tech nation with only 5.5 million people, and we have a very big neighbor with which we have a very long and troubling history. So just like any other developed nation, most of the critical infrastructure in Finland is not owned by the state, it's owned by private companies. But in my opinion, the leadership of private companies understand the importance of national defense very well. Partially that's explained by the national draft. Big part of the business leaders have gone to the army. And partially it's explained by the history, like both of my grandfathers fought the Russians in the Second World War. So we understand that we have to be able to defend as a nation together all parts of our society, civilians, military, business sector, public sector. It has to be organized so that we are able to have a credible defense. And that, of course, is a question of leadership. It always starts from the leadership. And that's why it's so great to see what Biden administration has been doing lately. They bring this up over and over again. They are actually making real difference in funding to build concrete steps that need to be taken to improve the defenses USA has against its own critical infrastructure. And especially how CISA, the critical infrastructure agency, has been like publicly coming out with practical things to do is something that I think is exactly the right things to do in USA right now.
Thank you. Johanna.
Yeah, I also think that in Finland there are certain very unique elements of the cooperation in the field of cybersecurity. And as the country is small, the resources in the cybersecurity is also very limited, and we don't have any massive centralized expertise in cybersecurity. So all the organizations need to build their own capacity in the and of course authorities are supporting them in this process. And these limited resources also mean that everybody needs to work together to do their share for the protection of critical infrastructure. And it also means that every organization is responsible their own cybersecurity, which definitely is a strength when you know your system and know your things. It's a very good thing. And as the country is small, the people in the cybersecurity, they learn quickly to know each other, and this creates trust. And I think trust is the key element in the successful cooperation, and it can of course be achieved many ways. And I think in Finland the trust on authorities is generally very high if you compare to other countries. But in practice this means that companies are willing, like voluntarily, to share information to authorities on cyber threats and the vulnerabilities they are facing. And this, of course, helps authorities to form situational image on cyber threats, and also to assist other companies facing similar threats, and maybe to avoid the attacks or to recover faster. But it's not only sharing information to authorities. I think the companies providing critical services are also willing to help each other by sharing to some extent, at least, information to each other. And I think this can be considered very unique as these companies are usually also each other's competitors. And we have in Finland roughly a network of like 300 or 400 critical organizations that share information, not only to Cybersecurity Center, but also to each other on a daily basis voluntarily.
Thank you, Johanna. I think it was really, really good and important that you brought the notion of trust into this discussion, and I would agree, trust and collaboration, and this is probably something that sets Finland apart in many ways from some countries where there is less of this culture of trust in public institutions and in public also horizontally in the economy and in society. And this is probably something that at least I hope will provide an edge for Finnish companies because trust is going to be an increasing asset for businesses. Trusted connectivity, broadly speaking, is something that will be ever more important. What about Colin? How do you see this?
I think there's a lot of exciting things going on. I agree that Finland has both a unique historical perspective, a unique culture, and I think a lot to teach. Obviously I'm thinking a lot about New York City and New York State, but the United States in general. One thing I think is operational collaboration to really change the cost curve of adversaries. Kind of like Johanna and Mikko said, that it's relatively straightforward for an attacker as a person to change ephemeral indicators of compromise, a web address or what have you. It's a lot more difficult for them to change how they do business. So I'm excited to see that in particular from CISA. Additionally, I really like the Securities and Exchange Commission recently proposed new rules for public companies, in particular to require updates about previously reported cybersecurity incidents, detailing the board of directors' expertise in cybersecurity risk. And maybe it seems like a mundane thing, but requiring cybersecurity disclosures to be done in something called the extensible business reporting language, which I think make it even more straightforward to share at machine speed information about cybersecurity incidents, because I think that's how, that I think is the future. And I think that one of the most, I think, challenging things in the current political environment, in particular in the United States, is the role of information and disinformation and political divisiveness. And I really like what Johanna said about trust, because I think one of the fundamental things we have to do, as defenders, is decrease the unverifiable trust surface and increase the overall level of trust in these systems, in our processes. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, and thanks again.
Thank you. And last word on this question to David. Also from the company point of view, how would a company like ArcticSecurity being ensconced in the Oulu ecosystem, and more broadly, the companies, how should they tap into the market?
Yeah, I think first about Finland, I think Finland's done an excellent job on sharing information and victim notification. Trafficom has done this for many years, and it's really had a material effect on helping make Finland more secure and have cleaner networks. So I think the US could learn a whole lot from that. I've many times had the discussion with DHS on this. We work with many national cybersecurity centers around the world who do this, and it's a very big help. And again, it's really part of building trust. I think a little bit on how to make things better in the US, I think we definitely have to go down the road of a bit more regulation, because unfortunately, very many companies, if they're not required to do something, they don't do something. So I think more regulation is going to help push people down the right path. Otherwise, we'll see big companies do nothing, and then something happens, and then the ensuing problems need to be fixed. So that's just general on your question, but I think it's, Finland also has a great example with private companies. They work a lot with security companies and together to make everything more secure and helpful. So I think it's this collaboration with authorities, working together, and helping everybody improve the security posture. So a lot to be learned from the private-public partnerships in Finland, which you don't see as much in the US, because there's some working groups, there's some overlap, but it's really DHS is DHS, and they do what they do, and then you have ISACs, and they're doing what they're doing, and companies there. So I think a little bit more coordination would help. Mikko, you had a comment?
Yeah, Mikko.
Yeah, I want to add on to what you're saying, David, is that in Finland, we do trust the public sector. We do trust the government. We trust the police. We trust the cybersecurity handlers and the certify and the work they do over there. And it's partially, I guess, because we're one of the least corrupted countries in the world. When you look at the international statistics, that we're always there in top 5. And that's a bit weird, because we have a very big neighbor, which is one of the most corrupted countries in the world. Russia is one of the most corrupted countries. We're one of the least corrupted countries. We have 1,400 kilometers or 1,000 miles of border with them. And sometimes people ask me that, what happens when you cross the border? You step over the border from the least corrupted country to the most corrupted country. What happens? Why does it work like that? And I can't answer, but it plays into all of the things we've explained.
Yeah, definitely.
Mikko, I have an explanation for that.
Yeah.
It's, they drink tea on that side of the border. We drink coffee, and not only do we drink coffee, but we drink it more than anybody else in the world, even more than the Swedes. But yes, and I think that Ronald Reagan was actually wrong when he said, some 40 years ago, when running for president, that he said that the most terrible thing then that he can think about is somebody coming and saying, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. And of course there are cultural differences, historical differences between the United States, differences in size of between the US and Finland. But Mikko, you're absolutely right that there's generally a high level of trust in public institutions which have earned that trust. Colin.
Yeah, and I think additionally the land border creates a psychological, there's a presence, I think, in Europe now, I think even more. And the United States has 2 giant oceans, very friendly neighbors, close allies to the north and south. I think New York City in particular, as a New Yorker, attacks are not theoretical to New Yorkers, and they're not theoretical to the Finns. This isn't some imaginary historical past in which something has occurred. This is like a real, present, palpable, taste in your mouth. I think in particular now with the largest land war in Europe since World War II, especially Finland, given the close I think the obvious historical analogy, and New Yorkers in particular, with cyber, the borders are irrelevant, basically. So it's in which that I think Finland is well suited because of its historical, social, geopolitical advantages in this area to take cyber very, very seriously. Whereas I think that's what I'm hoping we can learn, from you guys as New Yorkers, as Americans, how you've oriented really a whole of society approach to this important problem, because this is just the latest in a long line of very serious issues that your polity, your nation has faced and faced well.
Well, we're just about out of time. Is there anything that any panelist would strongly disagree with in terms of what someone else has pointed out? Any last minute remarks, observations? I'm afraid we do not have time for. I don't see any requests or any questions from the audience in the chat. Anybody last word? Mikko.
I'll just touch upon what really is happening in Ukraine in relation to what we were discussing earlier on about the importance of connectivity. I've had multiple meetings to Ukraine, to different cities in Ukraine during the war, over Google Meets, over Teams, over Zoom, with full HD, great resolution, no dropped frames. It keeps amazing me how well the country is online, even though they are in the middle of the war. And it's no mystery how they're able to do it. They've been defending against Russian attacks for a number of years. They've built their infrastructure, including their connectivity, in a unique way to be able to defend it. And they are defending it very actively. I mean, the cables are cut all the time, yet they go and repair them with great personal risk, which greatly shows us just how important connectivity is during times of crisis and times of war. But it does work. They are online.
Thank you, Mikko. I couldn't agree more. And somebody, Maribel Costa, in the chat is pointing out something that actually has crossed my mind many times. It's about why Israel is also such a leader in cybersecurity, because a bit like Finland, Israel they are a tribe, and it's a very closely knit society, and military service plays no small part in that, as well as the environment where they are. I wish to thank the panelists and the audience warmly, as well as the Consulate General for organizing today's panel. Let me just close by one observation. It was something that Colin, I think Colin said about there really being no borders when it comes to cyber. I happen to be in Ireland, and Ahern, I believe your last name is Irish. I happen to be in Dublin on the 24th of February, on the day when the war broke out in Europe, and I sense that even in Ireland, which, as I described it, has been in the Lord's purse, to borrow a Finnish idiom, in the Lord's purse, geographically speaking. Of course, that's not the whole truth, but very far from Finland's eastern neighbor. Even in Ireland, they understand very much that the long arm of the Tsar has a reach even there when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to hybrid, malicious hybrid influencing. So really no borders, but having physical borders has shaped Finland, and that is to just no small part behind why there is a sense and a culture of trust, which also permeates the Finnish business community. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of the afternoon or rest of the day in New York. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.